The moon loomed over the forest, casting a pale, frosty blanket of light over the huddling of trees. The child looked up to it, surrounded by an impossibly black sky with no sign of stars or satellites. Just that deep, dark black and that magnificent moon. They turned to look back at the oak tree. It towered and twisted up into the inky sky, struck in the spotlight of the moon. Around them, the trees stood silently, watching them from the dark. Leaves rustled sharply, murmuring to each other, still waiting as the child stood motionless. They were thinking of what their parents had said, how they'd been so worried, so angry, so hurt when they came back from the forest. How they held them and fussed them, telling them over and over how worried they were and how they couldn't go back. They could never go back. Their heart was beating fast, a deep drumming that shook their head until they felt dizzy, as if stood on a ship being rocked by crashing waves. They needed to choose, to turn back or continue on. Heart still pounding, they moved their hand forwards with intense care, as if reaching out to touch a wild animal. Electricity pumped through every nerve in their body. It leapt out in bursts of energy between their skin and the air around them, like lightning striking the trees. Everything was ecstatic. The trees cheering and the wind racing, pushing them forwards until their hand fell onto the rough bark. Everything stopped. The forest seemed to stand still as the bark began peeling back. Intricate threads of light burst through and darted between the trees. The bark continued to fold, burning away like paper and pouring out light until she emerged. The Dryad. When she stepped on the ground, spirals of grass rose like snakes and slithered across her feet. Her skin was wood, dark and rich and strong. Every part of her was speckled with dewy moss, and vines traced over her like rivers drawn onto a map. Tangled twigs stretched from her hands, her shoulders, her brow, reaching up and curving into a grand tiara upon her head. Her face was smooth, carved perfectly, and her eyes were fireflies that emitted a warm glow onto the child's skin. She smelt like freshly cut grass in the morning, and lavender rubbed between fingertips. The child gazed up at her in complete and utter awe. Everything around her seemed so alive. Yet when she took another step, her form crumpled, and she fell in front of the child. The child lurched forwards, cradling her in their arms. Their eyes darted over the Dryad, panicked, trying to understand how she was suddenly so weak. They listened to her breathing, slow and painful, as if the air around her was toxic and burnt her lungs. They watched a dull grey smoke escape from her lips, trickling like liquid into the air. They looked at her skin, scattered with chips and cuts as if she had been attacked, revealing the bone-coloured wood beneath. They touched the leaves on her arm and saw the yellowed spots of decay splattered over them, felt how they could be crushed into dust with a harsh touch. The Dryad whispered to the child now, barely louder than the scuttling of a mouse. She pleaded and begged and told them of her pain, such unbearable pain. She reached out to the child, touching their face, their hand, looking into their eyes as raindrop tears curved down her oaken face. The child held on tighter like a mother cradling a child. They needed to help, but how? How could someone hold something so beautiful, so powerful in their hands and give it life or hope? How could they begin to understand the hurt and destruction capable of wreaking such trauma onto something as precious as her? How could they stand in front of this danger, stare into its fiery eyes and cast it away with a fearless blow?
You're just a child.
They could never.
You're just a child.
They were only a child.
Just 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 a child.
It rang in their ears
Just
like an
a
alarm.
child.
All the times they had been told they couldn't do something, couldn't understand something, couldn't change anything because they were just a child. They couldn't because it was too big or too important or too complicated for just a child. All those voices yelled in their head as they looked down at the Dryad, whose eyes began to flutter shut with the delicate movement of a butterfly's wing. With a strength they didn't know they had, the child lifted the Dryad, her arm falling over their shoulder as they guided her onto her feet with fierce determination. Every muscle in their body yelled out in pain. But the child pushed past it, fueled by a fire that had burst into a flame inside them. As they carried the Dryad with them, they were going to save the Dryad, no matter what it took.